Well, I'm glad you're here watching my video on YouTube. The fact is, I don't know how long this will be up, since YouTube has decided to start censoring me and pulling down my videos. But don't worry, you can watch this video on rumble.com/randpaul, where I post all of my content. Love to see you over at rumble.com.
Thank you very much, Senator Paul. It's always good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Fauci. And there's been a lot of revelations in the last week, particularly from the NIH. There was the letter that talks about what they knew and what they funded in regards to EcoHealth Alliance's grant and gain-of-function research. How damning is this letter really for Dr. Tony Fauci?
You know, over the past several months, we've found a large amount of evidence that the virus, in all likelihood, originated in a lab. Some of this evidence is based on the fact that they were doing a type of research, gain of function, where they take an unknown virus and then they combine it with a known virus like SARS, which is a coronavirus from 2004, 15% mortality. They combine these viruses, they create a new virus, not known in nature, then they test it to see if it infects humans. Well, I've been saying that's gain of function research. Dr. Fauci's been denying it, but now the NIH has admitted yes. Some of the laboratory experiments in Wuhan were combining these viruses, and yes, the result did gain function, which means it gained lethality. They made a virus that's more dangerous than anything they had to be working with, but they're still trying not to admit that it ever really happened.
Right, so the NIH stopped short of calling it gain of function. They just say they created these viruses that were more powerful than the original virus, which is gain of function, right?
Sounds like it gained function, but here's the thing. They're saying it's not gain of function because before they did the experiment, they didn't know that's what they would create. But here's my point. If you have an unknown virus, you combine it with a known virus that causes pandemics, well, sure, you don't know what's going to happen, but it could be that you're going to gain function. So it is a gain of function. That's the purpose of the experiment, to find out whether the unknown virus, when you combine it with a known virus, can infect humans. Well, it's either going to infect humans or not, but you don't know it in advance. But just simply because you don't know it doesn't make it not a gain-of-function experiment.
Something I noticed from the letter is that in that letter, they said that they had requested unpublished documents from EcoHealth Alliance, unpublished reports. Clearly, they hadn't had these before. So my question, why hadn't they had them? And then now all of a sudden they're requesting them.
It sounds like maybe you're getting a little bit people, NIH now at odds with the EcoHealth people. Maybe they're cutting them loose and they're going to try to blame it on EcoHealth not obeying the rules. But the bottom line is EcoHealth has published this. It's in public journals. What I pointed out to Dr. Fauci is what's in the journal is gain of function research. He's denying it, but people have to realize he is not a disinterested party. If this virus came from a lab that he was funding, moral culpability attaches to him. He would be somewhat responsible for the pandemic. So he's going to deny till his last breath that the virus came from Wuhan or that he had anything to do with it.
And speaking of specifically that, he was on ABC's This Week on Sunday, where he said, quote, that it was molecularly impossible for those viruses that were worked on to have to turn into SARS-CoV-2 because they were distant enough molecularly that no matter what you did to them, they could never, ever become SARS-CoV-2. Has anyone definitively said that? Where is he in the basis of this?
He set up a straw man argument because I'm not alleging that the viruses in the experiments that have been published are COVID or became COVID. I'm saying the techniques they use, the gain of function techniques, could be used to create COVID, but obviously the Chinese haven't published that research. They're unlikely to publish it. So what Dr. Fauci is saying, well, it couldn't have been this virus because it's distant genetically from COVID. But I'm not alleging that. No one has alleged that these viruses from the experiments they published. We're alleging that if it came from the lab, they've now destroyed that evidence and they'll never let us know that it came from the lab.
So that's something that the NIH is also saying, and saying a lot. What basis are they alleging that there was no way that molecularly or genetically SARS-CoV-2 is related to what they were doing in Wuhan, to those viruses?
Some of the best articles that have been written about this have been from a scientist by the name of Stephen Quay. He looked at 9,000 blood samples. Actually, he reported on a study. The WHO did the study. 9,000 blood samples from China from 2019. If this came from animals, you should have already seen a few humans getting it. They tested 9,000 samples and found 0 people with it. Not finding any COVID in 2019 argues that this just suddenly went to humans, that it didn't transition from animals. The other evidence that this didn't come from animals, they tested 80,000 of those animals from those exotic wet markets that they talk about. Not one of them had COVID. So there's a lot of evidence pointing, it's not absolute. The Chinese are never going to admit this. They're not going to say, oh yeah, we did, we caused it, our bad. That's not going to happen. But there's a lot of indirect evidence pointing towards this. But the reason Dr. Fauci argues against it is because he funded the research. So he was funding gain-of-function research, he was funding the Wuhan lab, but what's even worse, he hasn't learned his lesson. When he's been asked in recent testimony, would you continue the funding?
Yep.
He says yes. In fact, there's still money going to this day to the Wuhan lab from the US taxpayer.
So I guess to nail it down, the NIH does not have the complete data or information from China to say definitively this is not related.
Right. If it came from the lab, the Chinese are never going to release that. I'm sure they've destroyed it by now. But he's arguing a false argument because he's arguing, well, the ones they've reported on aren't COVID. Well, yeah, I don't think they're going to publish that they created COVID in the lab. But they also have military labs. They've been dishonest in the investigation. They have withheld data. And so I don't think they are trustworthy. And I think this research is dangerous enough not to give the Chinese money to do it, but really dangerous enough that we shouldn't be doing it in the United States. We have 2 labs in the United States doing this research. There's a scientist from MIT who wrote in the Washington Post, this is not a conservative journal, the Washington Post, he wrote that this type of research could be a civilization ending kind of phenomenon, similar to like sharing nuclear secrets about how you make a nuclear weapon. That's what he said about this research. And yet the Democrats have refused to have one hearing on this. It's been going on. We've had a pandemic that caused 5 million people to die. We've had no hearings, 0 hearings on the origin of this or the possibility that it came from gain-of-function research that Dr. Fauci and the NIH was actually funding.
And that is true. It does seem that they care a little more when it comes down to animals. So Dr. Fauci has come under fire in the last couple of days, even from those who identify on the liberal ideology scale, for his department funding research that locked beagles in cages, had their skin eaten alive by sandflies in the name of research, with taxpayer funds and their vocal cords cut. Is that type of research necessary under any circumstances, and to spend taxpayer dollars on it?
We have to have more scrutiny of this kind of stuff. This is research that's so painful to the dogs that they're crying out in pain. They cut the vocal cords so the researchers don't have to listen to the dogs crying out in pain. Look, there may be a role for animal research in certain diseases. I'm not saying we absolutely ban it, but there ought to be an option not to do it, which is a bill I have to give people the option not to do it. But there also needs to be more scrutiny of this. This is also researching, this is US taxpayer dollars going to a disease we don't have in this country. This is for sand flies. I think this is a problem in Sahara and sub-Sahara Africa, but I don't think this is a big problem in the United States. And I'm not against helping other countries, with trying to figure out diseases, but to do this to dogs without any kind of scrutiny, there needs to be public scrutiny of this, and to me it sounds more like torture than research.
Well, and just to name a couple of the others that he's done, speaking of torture, there's funding that has went from the NIH to inject acid into monkey brains to see how they respond. Torture. And then just also at the University of Pittsburgh, grafting the scalps of aborted fetuses to rats and mice.
Yeah, disgusting. And we shouldn't let it happen. But the Democrats have turned a cold eye. They just have looked away and said nothing to see here, whether it's the origin of the virus or, torturing animals. So I think there needs to be more oversight on this. There are some Democrats who are interested, at least in the animal welfare. So when we introduced our bill to at least give the option of not experimenting on animals, we have 2 or 3 Democrats on it. I think we could get hearings on that, but there could be a time after another election, if we take back over, that I could be in charge of the health committee, and I promise you there are going to be investigations into the origin of the virus, because this could happen again, and there also will be investigations as to whether or not the animal studies that are happening are absolutely necessary.
Final question. Because of everything we've learned this week related to Dr. Fauci, I know we've talked about this before, you've sent the criminal referral to the Biden DOJ. Is he going to be held accountable in any way for
The o-
any of this? The
the o-
animal research, the COVID?
The only way I foresee he'll be held accountable is through the public eye. And people are talking about this. 6-9 months ago, I think he was on such a pedestal that nobody was questioning his authority. He could say anything, and it went to his head. Now he thinks he can say anything and that he's Teflon, he's immune from criticism. And the left-wing media still treats him that way. But I think his reputation has been tarnished in a great deal, and that he doesn't have the absolute authority that he once had. And this is good. People need to realize that he has a self-interest in suppressing all news about Wuhan because he did fund it. At first he says he didn't fund it, then he says it won't gain a function, and he's still trying to distance himself from that. But at the same time, he's still saying we should send more money to the Wuhan lab, we should send more money to China. And I think that naivete, that sort of making such terrible decisions, really should preclude him from having any office in government. He needs to be sent home.
So it would be public pressure on the administration and the government.
Absolutely, and there is. I don't think they'll divorce themselves. They're completely wedded to him, and he's a big believer in the collectivism that they promote. He thinks the collective is so important that it doesn't matter. If your child dies from a vaccine complication, he's like, well, most people do pretty well with it. You know, so he doesn't really care so much about the individual, he cares about the collective. And so he thinks collectively mandates are fine. He doesn't care too much about your liberty to make a decision about your medical care. He thinks that you should just do as you're told. And that's antithetical to, I think, everything our country was founded on.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.